tears turn to laughter, that child long ago. My soul starts to linger, it's home I know. If you catch me daydreaming now and forever, thoughts are carrying me along to that place we call home, down that long road.
New Ontario. In the early part of this century, that term equated to silver in the town of Cobalt, to gold, Kirkland Lake and Porcupine and Timmins, and the beginnings of such places as Englehart, New Liskeard, and Matheson, and those are just a few. And threading its way through the hard rock of the Shield and the very foundation of development in the north was a ribbon of steel forged in the foundries to the south. 2 successive episodes of sketches will be devoted to the story of the building of a people's railroad, its cause and its effect on a way of life on the James Bay frontier. So, come on aboard. We'll look first at the great clay belt of the town of Cochrane, and then we'll head down north to the bay.
The James Bay coast, ancestral home of the Swampy Cree, site of the first English-speaking settlement in today's Ontario. Following an ancient Indian canoe route along the Moose River system, Ontario Northland Railway's year-round workhorse, the Polar Bear Express, is heading south. The mixed passenger and freight Little Bear crosses the Abitibi River nearing its destination. Joined by the daily excursion Big Bear in the summer months, the train's arrival affects this place like the tides that influence a seaside village. The railway is Cochrane's reason for being. For those who live here, the train is a metaphor for a lifestyle that contrasts change with tradition. Susan Salmon is a part of it.
Jibanon have train Monday, Abto here, and I have Friday. To us, it's like a big city. Scary.
Rail yards, roundhouses, the playing fields where one learned the ropes. Such was the case for Claude Delisle.
Well, I've been here since 1957 is when I started on. They had just phased out the steam. I started with diesel. By the way, I'm third generation Delisle on the O&R.
Family bonds common to people like Tim Bluesas.
Well, I've been loading flat cars like this since my dad died. He was doing it for years before me.
And others, like Harris Bernstein.
If you go there in the morning, it should be all ready. Our business prospered and grew due entirely to the fact that the railroads were here, and Cochrane was a distribution center. And if it hadn't been for that fact, my father would never have settled here.
The dawn of the 20th century, the uncharted north of fairyland of adventure, where towns were born overnight, an epilogue in the tale of 2 cities. Albert Tucker.
The scene tends to shift to Toronto, and the ambition of Toronto's businessmen, as they become conscious of themselves, to compete with Montreal. Montreal was the headquarters of the CPR and the Bank of Montreal. It was becoming a kind of railway and financial capital. And I think Toronto, as it produced some of these wealthy businessmen, wanted to compete on an even level. And I think in some ways they drew in engineers who drew up these schemes to connect Toronto with James Bay through Hudson's Bay, and that would be a port, an access that Toronto would have, removing it from any dependence on Montreal and the St. Lawrence, to go out through Hudson's Bay and the Atlantic to Britain and Europe.
1902. From North Bay, a CPR town, an army of workers began to drive the steel of the Temiskaming and Northern Ontario Railway through granite and over bottomless swamp toward the Arctic watershed. The venture, spanning 3 decades, showcased the true grit of the industrial age.
The locomotives, particularly, that would be so fundamental. The flat cars, the passenger cars, even the private, sometimes they had rather luxurious private railway cars, were all built in Ontario. We really did have, I think, a self-sustaining railway technology well into the 20th century.
Plunging northward, the scheme opened the region to colonization, while mineral finds sprinkled communities along the survey route. The goal of joining up with an east-west line, also underway, fueled aspirations of a newly elected premier, James Whitney.
He came from southern Ontario. He did, however, realize that in a man named Cochrane, he had probably a very, very capable lieutenant in the north. And Cochrane owned a hardware store, and it was a pretty substantial hardware business in North Bay. He was elected for the constituency of East Nipissing, and Whitney now realized he had a politician who really could help him with whatever project the new Conservative government had for Northern Ontario, the new Ontario. They determined that one of the objects would be to extend the TNNO northward to junction with the National Transcontinental, and now they knew the name of the town. It would be Cochrane.
Along the 49th parallel, 750 kilometers north of Toronto, population approximately 5,000, the legacy of social and economic ambition. Founded in 1908, the town remains as gatekeeper for rail cargo bound for the population in the north, who are ever dependent on the lifeline of steel. For many in Cochrane, being part of that distribution chain has meant friendship and rapport with a network of people throughout the James and Hudson Bay region.
Yeah, we shipped you 18 pieces on the freight yesterday. Okay, James, I hope everything goes well there. That was James Rickard up here at the, he operates the Tidewater Goose Camp about 50 miles east of Moosonee at Hannah Bay. And he gets upwards of about 100 hunters coming up, mainly Americans from the Cleveland and northern Ohio and northern Pennsylvania area that he caters to. My father was an immigrant from Lithuania, and he started out as a peddler, peddling to wherever he could around Montreal, and then when he heard about the railroad construction, he started visiting those construction camps. And as he saw opportunities, he started supplying goods to the railroad contractors. And he started bringing in produce and fruits and vegetables. The railroad arrived in Cochrane, and my father thought it would be a good place to settle, and that's why he settled down here.
Cochrane became the center for what was called the Y, where the TNNO trains could make the necessary turns to come back south, where the National Transcontinental from Winnipeg, of course, could come through. It was the only town in which you had not just a TNNO railway station, you also had the National so they combined the two into a Union station. Now, no other town on the line had a Union station. That was distinct for Cochrane.
In its shared function as a hotel, the building today is pivotal to commercial traffic. Throughout 8 decades, it has come to symbolize progress for some, nostalgia for others. Growing up around the station has given artist Wentworth Falkins an atmosphere to draw on.
In those days, the station was the most important place. It was the busiest place in town, of course. There were a lot of trains going in and out. And it was probably the most beautiful station on the line. The station has its cupola, which was very, very distinctive, and a little weather vane that had a locomotive on it. And it is one of about 3 buildings in town, in Cochrane, that is unique to Cochrane.
The heyday of the Iron Horse, which gave employment to his father, gave Falkens a rainbow of unforgotten memories.
I made a lot of trips with my father, and he used to point out all the details. And I, as a kid, you wouldn't pay attention. But I guess some of it seeped in, and I'm able to use that material today to draw the details on the locomotives and so on. So I'd get to fire the engine, sometimes maybe run it a few miles, and that sort of thing. It was a lot of fun. I remember specifically coming back from Hearst in the middle of the night. It ran all night from about 1 in the morning till 5 or 6 when I got into Cochrane, coming down through Kapuskasing, and we didn't stop. And we were really flying. For a freight train, we must have been doing about 65 miles an hour. Most people don't realize that on those engines the noise was unbelievable, and the jolting and jumping around. It didn't ride like an automobile.
The steel rail pervades life here. Beyond buildings and machinery, it touches the cultural heart of this place. A district center, the threads of English and French-speaking Canada are intricately woven into Cochrane's makeup, the influence of east-west intersecting a north-south axis. A diversity of people owe their story to the elected social order of the early days of construction.
Many of those English settlers, certainly farther south, really were not inclined to work on constructing the railway. Their inclination was to operate the railway. They wanted to become the engineers, the conductors. The construction crews, however, are made up of a remarkable variety of peoples from Europe. Romanians, Bulgars, Swedes, Russians, who in many ways were much more evident on the construction crews than were English.
As it has influenced the social makeup, the railway as a way of life is a world unto its own.
I used to come down with my dad here a lot of times on a Friday night. He was a machinist. Well, that's like a mechanic, for the locomotives. Well, I used to fall asleep a lot of times right in the engine there. You can bet your bottom dollar and you woke up, you were thirsty. It's warm in those cabs. Well, our roundhouse was over to the east of the shops here, right where our powerhouse is now, our boiler room. Generally, it's kind of dark in there and stuff. I mean, not been too many windows in it. Just the windows in it at the time were just in front of where the locomotives in the pits. Well, that was kind of a protection. If the steam engine ever did roll ahead, it would just break the window instead of breaking the wall down.
Penetrating society in the James Bay frontier has left its impact. Susan Salmon, who came here from Port Albany several years ago, endeavors to soften the shock of transition for her extended Cree family.
A lot of people come here, they don't speak English, it's hard for them. Plus, they don't know what agency to go to. So that's part of my job, is to help them out. Find an apartment, what school to go to, and stuff like that. Like a lot of Native people can't afford phones, I guess, and in a way, so they kind of use the center to get messages through. So part of my job is to make sure these messages go through. Every year we have it's called a feast. We call it a feast to us, and it's, we serve wild food like rabbit, Canada goose and stuff, moose meat. And it's because a lot of them ask me to cook for them because they don't eat that kind of stuff at the nursing home. So I bring them here and I cook for them, and that's like a treat to them. was a lot of adjusting to go to. When we lived in Fort Almy, we didn't pay rent. Here you pay rent. Like we bought groceries. Here you do buy groceries, but over there we charge. Then we just pay at the end of the month, eh? There was some things I like it was different from Fort Almy, like there's theater, you know, places to go, restaurants. It was different.
The movement of goods and people, the sorting of loads for the next run north, the calendar of everyday life, the rhythm of Cochrane's economy.
Well, it's a busy job. This is a unique business. Everything from cars, machinery, equipment, construction equipment, building materials, Zambonis for ice surfaces. Well, there's no road to Moosonee, so naturally it'd have to go by rail. It's barged up from Moosonee once it gets to Moosonee, or a winter road in the wintertime. Stuff goes all the way up the James Bay coast, as far up as the east side of Quebec. Great Whale, I think it is, they're going now.
On the border of the Hudson and James Bay lowlands, Cochrane lies in an area known as the Great Clay Belt. This outcropping of arable soil motivated an extensive government promotion around 1909 to lure immigration, offering land at 50 cents an acre with the chance to supplement incomes with work on the railway in winter attracted a flow of arrivals. Farms were cleared. Glackmeyer, Clute, Lamarche, and Fournier townships were staked out and stripped of pulp and firewood. Ultimately, the reality of the short northern growing season would defy the hopes of many. Yet the anticipated metropolis of the north, laid out with streets 100 feet wide, was on the move, with fate in the waiting.
People, as they built or cleared the land, chopped down the trees, they had the stumps, they used the wood as they could, but they burned the brush. And it was all right, you know, on a calm day, but you could never be sure when a wind wouldn't come up.
Catastrophe. July 11th, 1911. Shifting winds fanned a hell's inferno as the great Porcupine Fire spread, snuffing the life of the rail town.
Our teamster drove my mother and the children on our delivery wagon to the railroad roundhouse, where everyone boarded, the whole town was there, and they were boarding freight cars and were taken out of the town, and I believe down south to Englehart.
And sometimes the construction crews would take care of these people who were now left homeless by enabling them to share in their food supplies until the government stepped in and helped the people much further.
Today we are cleaned out. Tomorrow we rise, read the Northland Post, as a town rebuilt on ashes. Incredibly, 5 years later, a second fire would once again bring Cochrane to its knees. And once again, the spirit of survival and the promise of a future were the bricks and mortar for renewal. Stories of endurance remain a part of the lore here, while silver threads also play in the bond of memories.
Cochrane was a great place to grow up. I lived right across the road from the beach, and so we were able to go swimming. My math teacher, Miss O'Toole, who was very well known to a lot of Cochrane people that grew up there, convinced me that I really should follow art. She was an artist herself, and she thought that I had the talent to go on in that field, and so I took her advice. Now this painting that is, I think, quite familiar in Cochrane now is of the station as it was back before it was modernized. In doing the painting, I had to make it interesting by including people that would ride the train and perhaps a couple of characters in Cochrane. I believe I have the principal of the high school, Mr. Marwick, And one of the students, way back along the side of the train, you'll see a man standing there with a cigarette. He's watching things going on. Well, he had a good reason to. His name was Bud Tickner. And Bud not only was the Chrysler representative in Cochrane, but he also was a fur dealer. And he used to deal with many of the natives buying and selling their fur. Then there's a man standing there, looks like a cowboy. Well, I use Stomping Tom Connors as the model for this person. He sort of represents a number of people that traveled on that train, you know. I intended to put Miss O'Toole in, but I didn't have a good picture of Miss O'Toole, and she was someone that you had to represent as Miss O'Toole, or you'd hear about it.
My wife and I have pretty well traveled the world, and we would never think of living anywhere else except Cochrane.
There is much that holds the people to this place, a counterforce to the transient pull of the rail. As each car is prepared for its run, the many that are affected by its coming and going can't help but be reminded of the bigger world along the rail line that they are a part of.
Okay? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
As for the rail line itself, its presence is forever woven into the fortunes and the fabric of life in the James Bay frontier.
The railway has to be seen in terms of a social and cultural necessity, perhaps more than in terms of an economic or financial success. It really opened up the communication from farms to towns, from farms to schools for children. It did all kinds of things in a social and cultural way that would not have been possible without the railway.
If the train is a metaphor for a lifestyle, then surely Cochrane, Ontario is a metaphor for the railway, its lifestyle shaped by the daily touch of the iron horse.
To that place.
In a future episode, we will follow the rail to the end of the line, to the story of Moosonee and Moose Factory, Ontario.